It's a feature of the Eastern, and particularly Muslim, character to relate with great precision the facts they witnessed or stories they've been told, without introducing the slightest change in them. And they hold before themselves the example of the Holy Book, which has to be repeated without the slightest change. Therefore, the stories present a great precision, even though they've probably been retold for many generations. So now we're ready to open this mysterious book, a door into the past of mankind, and a door that leads us into a wonderful and unusual world. And first we must get acquainted with the people whose stories are told there, their mental setup and cultural attitudes. And it's a world of brilliant knights who never experience any fear when in danger, but may easily faint before a beautiful girl. A world of enchanting girls with innocent looks who can seduce the best man and play a dirty or even cruel joke on him. And a world of great rulers who can order their best friend's head to be chopped away just because of some word that they didn't like, or to forgive the life of a sentenced person who tells them a good story. A world of wild adventure and of people who are willing to risk their lives just in order to contemplate beauty, and in the face of deadly danger, praise God for making flowers so beautiful. And knowing that no matter in what a desperate situation they may be in, the Almighty will save them, and that the only these things happen that to happen, nothing else being possible. And this strange world, which belongs to the pages that have been torn from our history, is full of ever-present genies, or jinn, who appear at the least expected moments in order to help people, with some exceptions of those who came to harm. But they are rare and explainable, and as things happen over this ancient world, as a great protecting shadow, these jinn protect those who need protection, and it's the invisible but constantly present ideas, concepts that are in people's hearts and minds that aid them and image the wisdom of Solomon ben David in peace and prayer with both. Now, if only one or two stories are read, they may seem fantastic enough to consider them as products of imagination. But when you continue reading, the descriptions of the jinn begin to follow a certain pattern. More hints at their origin can be found in each new story that you run across. And the reader will begin to recognize strangely familiar things. That is, familiar to our present civilization, but completely unknown in the described times of that era. At least after reading over half the book, one begins to see a sort of connection between the descriptions found in different stories, falling together as parts of a puzzle to a present and a whole picture. One begins to recognize strangely familiar things. Things that you catch over and over throughout the books. And after finishing this great book, all things have occupied their precise places in the great whole context, showing us very clearly that part of our past, which has been denied us by history, by filling the gaps and interplacing with the so-called legends of other civilizations and offering a complete new idea of a long period in this past of mankind of ours, being able to project some light on things that are happening in our present time. And one thing should stand out quite clearly from the beginning. Jinn are not ghosts or spiritual beings, as modern interpretations of Oriental mythology would like to make us believe. The people in the stories are physically similar to us, but on a different level of cultural and technological development. And also it's obvious that the narrators sometimes mistook machines for living beings. Many strange beasts and such are described. Now, a machine controlled by an intelligent being appears to be acting in an intelligent way, and for an observer who has never been seeing any machines before, that would be far more complicated than the simplest application of levers, such as a machine. It would appear as a living creature, and it would appear to be an intelligent one. Later, we'll try to point out and explain in detail who the Jinn were and the achievements of their technology and knowledge, as well as indicate the exactitude of the descriptions in the 1001 Nights, where things are related that can be known only to people who have experienced them, and which would be impossible to imagine correctly for somebody belonging to a non-technological culture, as that of the ancient Arabs. At this point, though, we want to return to the missing pages in our history to fill in these gaps, to offer replies for the unanswerable questions, and finally allow the reader to see the complete aspect of the whole jigsaw puzzle, mankind's past here for the viewer. And our story begins far away in time and space, probably on some faraway planets, if you read the first 2 chapters of Genesis, because it's not difficult to find such contradictions between the first and second chapters, that it's difficult to understand how such a great thinker such as Moses could write about such contradictory things and illogical things unless they're not contradictory and illogical. Now, it's very probable that many pages have disappeared from between these chapters. And it's not our purpose here to discuss the Old Testament, establishing who is who or whatever. We're referring here to things that show that in the 1001 Nights there are corroborations with other writing. Now, reading the Genesis as it is written, it's obvious that the people created by God in the beginning were not Adam and Eve, as well as that these later ones were not created by God. Well, sometime after God created people according to his own image, creating men and women, blessing them and ordering them to grow and multiply, and an ingenious scientist evidently named Yahweh or Jehovah, possibly slightly envious of the fact that God had the power to create everything, began some weird experiments. And experiments on a life on this planet, of which we could not assure whether it was Earth or not. And this Yahweh knew that he was unable to create in the proper sense of the word, making things be just by ordering them to be, but he had hands with which he could fabricate many things, and he made man of clay, naming him Adam and blowing life into him by some scientific process insufficiently described to be worth discussing. Well, once this god or jinn saw that Adam really lived, he was filled with joy and pride, of course, and afterwards he called all of his friends to show them his achievement. He requested that they admire Adam and bow before him. According to the tradition, everyone did except one, Yahweh's best friend, a proud and wise man called Iblis, a great warrior and commander of a powerful army, and also a man filled with love for fine art, music, and singing. And he refused to bow before Adam. And I can even imagine that he probably made some unfavorable remark about his surrogate man, saying that nothing good could be expected from a thing made of dirty clay. Well, we can just imagine that that was the end of a fine friendship, since Yahweh probably told Adam to stay away from Iblis and his people. Still later, after many years, in the times of the 1001 Nights, Arabs used the expression May God confound Iblis. And here you see a couple of deity figures from these early cultures in the Mideast. Well, Yahweh's problems with Adam began almost immediately, of course. First, he had to make a garden with plants to provide food for his invention and give him adequate company, making all kinds of animals for whom Adam invented arbitrary names, and finally realizing that animal could replace human company, even for artificially manufactured man. And so he at last remembered that God created not only man but also woman, and nobody knows whether by this time he'd run out of clay, or his clay reviving device had suffered some mechanical defect, or maybe it had been spoiled by Iblis in order to put an end to such anti-natural experiments. Well, the fact remains that Yahweh was no longer in conditions to make woman of clay, and having to resort to living tissue for this, so he performed some surgery on Adam under anesthesia, described in Genesis as making sleep fall on Adam so that he fell asleep, and finally succeeding in producing a woman, whom he did not even bother to give a name. Well, almost everyone knows what happens in Eden, and the various legends of humanity in the prehistory eras, how Adam and his woman were exiled to Earth. It was probably the first planet-wide concentration camp in human history, and only after arriving on Earth did Adam decide to give the woman a name, calling her Eve. And it's easy to imagine how Iblis chuckled looking at Yahweh's troubles with his pets. It's interesting also that I've found no evidence could identify Iblis with a Christian's concept of Satan, who is a mysterious being if one tries to search for him in the Bible, and needs some words of rehabilitation. But this I might do on some other occasion. And in the contrary, Iblis is differentiated from Shaitan, who is the Islamic version of Satan. So they are obviously different persons. And since this time, of course, two different races, though similar in appearance, inhabit our planet. The Old Testament makes this distinction by calling them children of God, indicating that they are those who are literally, directly created by God, and the children of men, as descendants of this artificially produced Adam. Now this can be checked in Genesis, where sons of God are mentioned to interbreed with the daughters of men, and they gave heroes as offspring. This fact also appears in Greek mythology, the heroes being the children of Olympic gods and Terran women. Now the Arabs simply called these hybrid races the Jinn, who obviously inhabit an infinity of planets in the universe, and the Adamites, or Ibn, or Adam, who inhabit the earth. As an example of this, an Arab prince says to a Jinn princess, "How can it be that you, a princess of the Jinn, have fallen in love with me, an Adamite, an inferior being?" And the Jinn boasts, "No Adamite has ever placed a foot on this ground." And another Jinn explains to an earthman, "I must warn you that it is impossible for a son of Adam to know by looking at her face whether a daughter of Eve is really a virgin, since this knowledge belongs only to God and His chosen ones." Now we can't venture too many thoughts as to when exactly the Jinn landed on Earth, but the Egyptian records and scriptures tell about strange sights in the sky as far back as the reign of Thutmose III, which was about the century 15 BC, Ramses II, which is 1304, 1237 BC, when he was left alone by his friends. He received help from people coming from the sky, and they told him to attack his enemies all alone, which he did, defeating them